Hey guys, thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm going to talk you through how I painted these birds' wings. In the description box down below, I've included the materials that I'm using, as well as a link to a blog post where I explain in further detail some of the terminology you're going to hear me use. I've also included a link to my Patreon where you can find a long-form, complete tutorial for this bird, and it comes with a step-by-step PDF and a sketch and reference photos. Alright, let's get into the details of this tutorial. So the first thing I did was to paint the wing area with just plain water so that I could add color using the wet and wet technique. It's what you can see me doing right here. And as I go forward with this, I'm going to be using multiple blues instead of just one color. And because the paper is wet, they're going to blend and blur into each other quite nicely. And this is going to be my first foundational layer on the wings. Now technically this is a second layer, but I'm still treating it kind of like a foundation of color. I just wanted to intensify some of the colors here, and because the weather was quite hot this day when I was painting this, the paper was drying faster than I could get paint from my palette. Okay, second official layer. I waited for everything to dry completely before starting in here. Now what I'm doing is I'm approaching the wing in sections, and I'm doing this so that I can start painting in shadows and defining feathers that are overlapping each other. I'm using a negative space painting technique to make certain parts of the wing recede and other parts of it come forward as the top layer, because of course feathers are overlapping each other, and even though they're obviously quite close to each other, they're still going to cast some form of shadow. Here the shadow is more distinct, so I'm coming in with a darker neutral tint. You can see I've also used the wet and wet technique so that that shadow I just painted in isn't a harsh line, it just blurs outward. While technically I'm just painting lines here, this is actually the shadows of those overlapping feathers. They've kind of blurred away as it's dry, but I'll come back in later and really define those a bit better. Okay, on to a different section while this one I just painted dries. I'm doing the same thing where I made it wet with water first before coming in with pigment. I was careful not to scrub the previous layer so that it didn't reactivate. I just want what I'm painting now to sit on top. I'm also starting to paint in those lines, and as you can see, the paper started to dry, so that's why those lines are actually appearing a little bit more defined. This is okay. The reason why I used water first was so that initial pop of blue blurred outwards. That's the part that is the beginnings of a shadow from these upper feathers that you can see me painting right now. I'm also coming into those feathers and just doing another layer of color because I realized they were too light. They just need to be intensified. Now for some details. The previous layer was totally dry, so what I did was I made the paper damp before coming in here to paint the shadows. I'm using, again, the negative space painting technique. I'm painting the area below the feathers, and then I'm going to pull up some of that color in lines to start bringing out those feather forms. So these lines that I'm painting are essentially very tiny shadows of the feathers that are overlapping each other on this part of the wing. And here you can see that I realize I need to have a few small feathers up top, so I'm repeating that same negative space painting technique where I'm painting the area below and pulling up the lines and then using some water to blur the area below so it's not just a block of color beneath those baby feathers. From this point forward, I'm going to be repeating this same process quite a bit as I start to coax out those feather details. You could say now this is kind of like the fourth layer of painting. I'm using negative space painting technique and thin lines to imply feathers. If you want to see this process in real time and in a larger scale, just go back to the 5-minute and 35-second mark of this video. I'm essentially doing the same thing now as I was doing at that part of the video, but less wet and wet so that I have more control. Right now I want the paper to be mostly dry so that the marks I make don't just become blurry or fuzzy. If the lines are too distinct, I can always come back in before they dry with some water and gently blur it with more control than if I was to be painting with wet and wet. Something else I wanted to point out, I'm using it's not a very small brush, but it's the round shape and it has a nice point. And so I'm able to get these thin lines by having the brush more perpendicular to the page so that I'm really only using the tip. That's how I'm able to create such thin lines. Here, I've realized that the upper part, or at least some parts of this wing, are too light. So I'm just coming in and gently glazing in a little bit of color, not too much. I don't want it to overwhelm all the marks that I just made. And that's essentially it for the biggest area of this bird's wings. The rest of this video, you're going to see me repeating the same steps to start pulling out the details on the other sections of the wing. So to recap, I've essentially painted this in 4 layers. Layer 1, the foundation of color using wet and wet. Layer 2, intensifying some of those colors in case they dried too light. Layer 3, using the negative space painting technique to start adding shadows and definition and the line work of individual feathers. And layer 4, any last tweaks and finishing touches to bring out the contrast or fix any areas that just need a little bit more definition. And there you have it. You may find that you only need 3 layers if your initial foundation layer had enough color that you could move straight into the negative space painting technique to start pulling out the details. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you liked it, please feel free to subscribe for more, and if you're in a good mood, feel free to give it a thumbs up. And also, if it inspires you to do your own bird painting, please don't be shy to share it with me. I always love to see your work. Happy painting, my friends. Bye.